As of 2021, there are around 1,800,000,000 websites on the internet. One of them shows a detailed satellite map of a small island, 16 meters long and 530 meters wide. You can see tree shadows, rocks, and a waving flag at maximum zoom in. Throughout the island, there are interactive signs with numbers. Among the many dark gray markings are others of an earthly hue. Clicking on one opens a window with a list of names. There is a timer beside each one that counts the time. Some are not even a year old yet. Others are over 40 years old. Almost all the counters are active, but some have stopped. Here's one of them. George Broderick's timer stopped at 30 years, 242 days, 46 minutes, and 25 seconds. It happened when his son William put his father's history on the card. George divorced his wife shortly after the baby was born, so William never knew his dad. When he grew up, he tried to find George, and his search ended at the Traveling Cloud Museum website. Here, you can take a virtual walk through a vast cemetery. Yes, the signs on the map indicate the mass graves, and the numbers on them indicate the number of people buried at the site. Some remains haven't been identified, so they're labeled nameless. And heather markers are placed over those graves where the dead have been found to have died of AIDS. An anonymity clock is started for each person. A timer shows how much time has elapsed since the burial. It only stops after the site tells that person's story. But most of them will remain forgotten in this terrifying place underground in New York. In the Long Island Strait lies Hart Island. Until recently, this stretch of land wasn't on any maps. That's because of its creepy history, which began over 150 years ago. So what's under New York City, besides the underground and sewers? Most people in the city have never heard of Hart Island or other Potter's Fields. This is the name given to the burial grounds of the poor and people whose identities are unknown. Virtually all of New York City's parks are on such sites. Hart Island was initially set up as a prisoner of war camp during the Civil War. Then, for nearly 200 years, it changed one owner after another until it became an official part of the city in 1868. The authorities decided to use it to bury residents whose families could not afford to pay for a funeral. Any bodies that remained unclaimed for 30 days in local morgues were taken there. New York's Department of Corrections managed the island, so the burials were handled by the inmates of Rikers Island Prison. Once a week, they took about 25 bodies there, and the prisoners dug a grave, one grave for 3 people. More than 1,000 people were buried this way in a year. The first was 24-year-old Louisa Van Slyke, who died in 1869 of tuberculosis. The American woman had no relatives, and her body was sent to Hart Island. When an outbreak of yellow fever broke out in the town a year later, they set up a quarantine station for the infected. Later, they built a tuberculosis hospital on the island and a center for drug addicts and the mentally ill. By the 1930s, the old graves were being reused. One day in the woods, workers came across a strange marking, SC.B. Wan, 1985, SC.B1, 1985. It turned out that a child who had died of AIDS had been buried there. In the 80s, 16 more victims of the disease were buried on Hart Island. The bodies were buried more than 4 meters deep, while the pit's depth for the ordinary dead did not exceed 90 centimeters. A big fire in July 1977 destroyed some of the documents, so the exact number of people buried on Hart Island is unknown. It's thought to be more than 1 million. A huge number for a 1.5-mile piece of land. Even though the government funds the cemetery, the island has long been absent from official city maps. Nor was it mentioned by the New York City Department of Transportation. It wasn't until 2015 that they partially included its area on enlarged maps of neighboring boroughs. The cemetery was open to the public in the same year, but only once a month on weekends. Other times, not even the relatives of the people buried there can visit it. A special permit is needed for that. It seemed as though the dreadful days of New York's most significant Potter's Field were over. But recently, the government has been reminded of it. When the coronavirus pandemic struck in 2020, the local morgues were overcrowded. And while Hart Island used to bring in 25 bodies a week, at the peak of the epidemic, The same number of new graves appeared in a day. The New York City Underground has other equally bloody stories. Before Manhattan became a modern concrete jungle, cows were running around. In the 19th century, the western part of the borough was devoted to slaughterhouses, while they drove cattle from New Jersey farms down 12th Avenue. Now it's called the West Side Highway. As the city began to sprawl, so did traffic. The traffic jams caused by herds of cows made life tough for residents, and they built underground tunnels for the animals. Researchers have been trying to find evidence of their existence for over 100 years. Some say it's been nothing more than talk, but journalists have managed to find an official plan. The 1932 blueprints show a 200-foot cow pass under 12th Avenue. It's thought to have been demolished due to new construction in the 20th century, but there's a good chance that the old cow tunnel remains intact to this day. After all, many dungeons and catacombs beneath the city remain as they were. One of the most famous is the Freedom Tunnel. The Freedom Tunnel is one of the most famous of these places. Up until 1980, they used it for freight trains, and when the tracks were discontinued, the tunnel became a mecca for graffiti artists. It wasn't just street art lovers who took to the site. The homeless had built a veritable city under the city. Journalist Jennifer Toth, The Mole People, 1995, has written about the horrors of the slum in her book, The Mole People. In 1991, use of the tracks resumed, and the people who had settled there were kicked out. The Liberty Tunnel still exists, but it doesn't look as apocalyptic as it did at the end of the last century. Although the visitors you meet there might not be the best company. If you want to swim in New York, head to the municipal swimming pool in McCarran Park. It was built during the Great Depression and then renovated. Alternatively, you can wash your feet under the building, which houses drainage pipes and utility access tunnels. But it's an illegal pastime, with all the consequences that entail. You can experience the spirit of the New York dungeon without breaking the law. Beneath the 200-year-old St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, Soho, are ancient catacombs. Don't sneak in at night, but take a civilized guided tour for an hour and a half. There are graves there too, but unlike on Hart Island, they're well known. The dungeon is the resting place of prominent New Yorkers such as Bishop John Conley. Another subterranean urban location became accessible to visitors at Bergen Street and Franklin Avenue. Brooklyn's first brewery opened there in 1849. The neighboring brewery and low-temperature freezing caves were connected to the establishment through an underground tunnel. The brewery is long gone, but the crown-finished caves now house a cheese ripening cellar. There are occasional guided tours, though the adventure may not be as easy as it first appears, as not everyone can stand the distinctive smell of stale socks. However, if you're a fan of the extreme, you can opt for the less than eventful places to visit. There are hidden tunnels everywhere in New York City, with many non-functioning underground stations among them. Beneath the fashionable Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan, there is a hidden underground road, Track 61. The platform has been used by famous hotel guests to get into the hotel quietly. A private carriage would go under the building, and its passengers would take the lift directly to the hotel. It is known that this method of transport to the hotel was used by General John J. Pershing back as early as 1938. Later, Route 61 delivered U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and pop art king Andy Warhol. The latter even threw a party in the underground. The platform has long since been abandoned, but the freight lift entrance remains in place. Another underground New York landmark is the Cobble Hill area. In 2010, the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel made the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest underground tunnel in the world. The half-mile-long tunnel belonged to the railroad and was built in 1844, 60 years earlier than the city's underground system. In 1961, it was closed for safety reasons, and in the early 80s, Brooklyn resident Bob Diamond discovered it by accident. He started taking tours there and even got a permit for it. His tours continued until 2010, when they suddenly terminated the man's contract. Now it's impossible to get a legal tour of the world's oldest underground tunnel. Myrtle Avenue Station is one of the transformed closed stations in the world. In 1980, local artist Bill Brand turned it into a work of art, more accurately, a film. He arranged 228 huge drawings on the walls, which are a frame-by-frame film. It can be seen for about 20 seconds if you drive north from DeKalb Avenue. We can also find exciting discoveries in the underwater part of New York. Hidden in the riverbed, there are vast pipes of gas lines. They stretch to the Gulf of Mexico, about 17,000 kilometers long. It takes almost a week to transport the fuel. Somewhere around these pipes lurks a real treasure. In 1903, a barge capsized between Staten Island and New Jersey. 7,678 pieces of silver bullion were on board. They recovered about 6,000 of them, but the rest had sunk into the silt and have yet to be found. Treasure hunters are regularly trying to find the lost silver. It's now estimated to be worth around $26 million. Write in the comments which of these places would you like most to visit. And liking this video and subscribing to the channel is sure to bring you luck in your treasure hunt.